So the main aim for this session is to understand HR procedures and legal requirements. In doing that, we will, by the end of this session, be able to explain the legal requirements that must be adhered to when dealing with recruitment, selection, discipline and grievance, sickness and absence, and harassment and bullying. And you'll also be able to describe the HR systems and procedures within your organisation and how they meet these legal requirements. Right then, let's have a look at the first part. But just before we get into the actual detail on that, I just want to start by saying that what you actually do and what you're required to do will be based on your organisational policies and procedures. We're basing this on the ACAS, that's the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, and their guides. So you see, that's just come up on the screen. Website www.acas.org.uk, recognised body who aim to provide services to resolve work-related discipline and promote harmony within the workplace. So the areas we've identified: recruitment, selection, discipline and grievance, harassment and bullying, and sickness and absence, which we've already covered in the last session, and you've got an ACAS guide there. You can see that all these areas fit into their outline completely. So let's start looking at discipline and grievance. So for discipline and grievance, we've got two guides from ACAS. The first is Discipline and Grievance Guide, which gives explanations about how to handle, deal with situations that you might find yourself in, and it gives examples. The second is the Code of Practice on Discipline and Grievance, and it provides basics or guides for employers, employees and representatives in the whole document on the principles that should be employed when handling disciplinary or grievance situations. What it goes to state are that the process was taken on board. It was a trade union document originally, but it was laid before the Houses of Parliament in January 2015 and came into effect by the order of Secretary of State in March 2015. It states that there should be a written policy about disciplinary and grievance rules in organisations, and that there's a requirement to make staff aware of them so they know what rules and processes are expected of them. And it should not be just assumed. It isn't sufficient to just assume that employees will know what is expected and what is not expected of them, because people have different perceptions of things, such as what is deemed as being tidy, what is deemed as being prompt. So the guide, the Code of Practice, outlines these, and it also goes on to mention some key steps that employers should put in place when they're dealing with those situations. At this point, I'd just like to add that that Code of Practice is not actually enshrined in law, but employment tribunals will look at it and use it as a guide, because that's what the government set out for it to be, and use it as reference when dealing with situations. So in reality, we should be following it. So let's have a look at the key steps that it outlines. So key steps in the table just appeared on your screen. Discipline on one side, grievance on the other. 5 steps. We'll just go through the discipline process first. So the first step is about establishing the facts, gathering info. Employers should carry out necessary investigations to establish the facts before they decide whether to proceed with a disciplinary process. It makes sense, but often it doesn't happen and people just charge in there. It needs to be consistently done, it needs to be timely, and it may involve holding investigatory meetings with employees and other people involved, just to make sure that there is enough there to go down the disciplinary route. And if so, we go to step 2 and we inform the employees of the problem. If there is a case to answer, the employee should be notified, and this would be expected to be in writing, and this should contain enough information, not only of what the allegation is, but so that they've got enough information to prepare a case to answer it at a disciplinary meeting. Obviously, it should also give, I mentioned disciplinary meeting there, it should give information about the next stage, date, time, location of the meeting, and also give them any information they need to make sure that they're forewarned of the process and what's going to go on, because the next stage would be to hold a meeting to discuss that disciplinary action, and they're allowed to be accompanied. So the employer should be setting out at this meeting the case, and then the person who's being accused should be allowed to defend that case, and this is their statutory right. And it's a statutory right to be represented, because this could lead to a formal warning or some other disciplinary action. It's almost like a hearing. If the worker or the employee's chosen companion isn't available, then the employee is duty bound to make every opportunity to postpone it and make every reasonable effort to accommodate a suitable date for that person to have the representation of the chosen person. And once that meeting's taken place, then you'll be deciding on appropriate action, and it shouldn't be before. And often people feel that the actions have already been decided. After the meeting, you're going to be deciding in whether the action is justified, and if it is justified and there is going to be disciplinary action taken, then the employee will be formally informed of the outcome, usually in writing, and it could result in things such as, and this will be dependent on your organisation's policy and procedures, and it should be clear in their guidance what the potential outcomes could be. So it may be verbal warning, written warning. If it's a second written verbal warning, then it might be going to written warning, or if it's more serious, it could be an automatic dismissal, but it needs to be clear in the policy. And finally, at step 5, there needs to be an opportunity to appeal. If the employee feels that the decision is unfair or unjustified, then they should be able to appeal, and this is normally done in writing, and the appeal should be dealt with by somebody impartial who has not been involved in the disciplinary process to that point. So that's the discipline process. On the grievance side, the first step is not actually a step in the process, but if somebody's wishing to bring a grievance against their employer, you would advise them or support them to make sure they've gathered facts and evidence, so that they have got something to back up their grievance and not just making a grievance. If they do and they feel they want to go, you should be advising that they should inform their employer following policies and procedures, which should normally be written, and they will raise it. Timely manner, shouldn't be delayed, so they shouldn't be coming up with grievances for something that happened way in the past, and it should be filed with somebody who's not involved in the issue or the grievance. From that, there will be a meeting held, and the employer should arrange this without delay and allow accompaniment, the same as the disciplinary, and every effort should be made to make sure that the chosen representative, the person they want to be accompanied by, can attend. From that, the action will be decided, and they should be told without delay of the outcome and the actions to be taken. And really the difference is here we're seeking their acceptance. Do they accept what the outcome is? But if not, they should be allowed to take it further, and they should be informed of how they can go about appealing, and it should be heard as soon as possible in line with policies and procedures. Now, maybe in your role you're not going to be directly involved as a person in this process, but as a team leader or a team manager of this individual, you should be making sure you have a duty of care to make sure that they are that procedures being followed, that they've got their rights, that they know what's going on, and they're being supported and advised properly. That's not about you backing them against the company. It's just about making sure that you're in a duty of care to your employee is being carried out, unless of course you are directly involved in either the discipline or you are the person the grievance is about, and then that's a different process. But in a nutshell, the guides have got a lot more detail, and so is the website, but they are the key steps that we've got to ensure are being followed so that the people are being treated fairly. Now then, let's look at bullying and harassment. Covered under the Equality Act 2010, I think first what we should establish is what it is and make sure we're clear about what the meanings are. I think the best way to do that, before we look at some technical sort of detail, is to look at what ACAS say, according to them, what people say when they're normally describing it, and they usually define bullying or harassment as something that has happened to them that is unwelcome, unwarranted, and causes a detrimental effect. I think that sort of briefly puts it in a nutshell, but additionally there's a guide on bullying and harassment at work, and it goes on to explain what the technical words for it is, and they're up on the screen now. Harassment is classed as unwanted conduct related to a relevant protected characteristic, we've talked about those before, which has the purpose or effect of violating an individual's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for that individual. So that can be quite individual to that person about how they feel. Mention there the protected characteristics that we've discussed before, and harassment applies to age, disability, gender reassignment, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation, but it doesn't apply to pregnancy or maternity, as if these are used, they're seen as unfavourable treatment, may be considered as discrimination. It also doesn't include the marriage and civil partnerships, as there is no evidence that it's needed in this sort of area. But a complaint really doesn't have to possess the relevant characteristic themselves, because as we talked about before, it can be about association with a person who has that characteristic, or just because they're wrongly perceived to be in one of those protected characteristics, or they feel they're being treated as if they do. So we just need to be careful of that. And then bullying. The ACAS guide goes on to talk about bullying as offensive, intimidating, malicious or insulting behaviour and abuse or misuse of power through the means of undermine, humiliate, degenerate or injure the recipient. The impact on the individual can be the same as harassment, and the words bullying and harassment are often used interchangeably in the workplace. So really detailed sort of guide there, and you can read more in the ACAS guide. So wide-ranging definitions there. I think the key is if an employee makes a complaint they are being bullied or harassed, then their grievance needs to be dealt with regardless of whether or not the complaint meets that standard definition, and it's in that investigation that will be decided. The ACAS guide, as I've said a number of times in the resources, so you can read that in detail, covers some key points. The first being it says that the bullying and harassment is covered under the Equalities Act 2010, which we've already established. It also, again, as we said with discipline and grievance, there's a duty to make sure that the policy is actively promoted and ensure it's known, not just assume it. If there's a complaint made against an employee, an employer or a customer, and that came in under the 2010 Act, in that it doesn't have to be an employee, it could be a customer or someone who comes into your business who harasses or bullies someone, and if the employer is made aware of that, they need to take reasonable and proportionate action against that person. They can't just ignore it and say, well, they don't work for me, I've got no control over that. Under the new Act 2010, they have a responsibility to protect their employee. It also needs to set an example from the top down. We can't afford to see senior managers' behaviour breaking the policy. If we're seeing bullying from higher management to lower management, nothing's been done about it, the chances that people are going to take it seriously and complain isn't going to happen. And if there is a complaint, we need to investigate it fully and take it seriously. People in this situation usually get very aggrieved and take time before they complain. And finally, we can try and resolve it informally with that approach first, with counselling and mediation, because sometimes that might be better. But we need to use the different discipline and grievance policy to take any action against anybody. So we relate back to the previous policy we looked at there. And then finally, we need to treat it as a chance when it happens to review and examine policies, procedures, working methods, and see if we can put something in place that's going to stop it happening again. So at least we get something positive out of it, and we can show that we've taken actions to protect people. And again, you may not be the person who definitively deals with it, but your role as a leader is to ensure that the processes and procedures are followed and that everybody's being treated fairly. Finally, we'll take a look at recruitment and selection. The key areas of law affecting this sort of area are discrimination, right to work in the UK, criminals record checks, and with all that comes data protection. When recruiting staff, employers need to be sure and understand that they keep up to date with legal obligations. We need to make sure that recruitment selection procedures meet the law, and I know lots of them say, oh, we've got an HR department that deals with that, but in larger organisations that may be true, in smaller ones they may be stretched, and also there are parts of it that as a team leader or a supervisor manager you can end up being directly involved with and hold some responsibility for, and we'll look at those in a little bit of detail. But ACAS has a collection of resources which I've supplied in the handouts, which you can use to sort of try and check that you're actively recruiting and employing people within the law. And the first thing, employers need to be sure that when they advertise vacancies or any new roles that they don't discriminate. There's no discriminatory language in there, and you may not have a direct involvement in that, but you need to be aware about it. Where you might start to get involved is selecting candidates for interview, etc. The successful applicants need to be selected without any discrimination, and it's about making sure that there is no unconscious bias that we talked about before, and that we're clear, and that's where it's better if there's more than one person involved. But as soon as the successful applicant is offered the job, you can end up being involved at some level, and you need to recognise and organise a carefully planned programme to settle them in, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail, because you want them to become as effective as soon as possible, and of course you want them to stay, and part of that is making them feel welcome. And we also need to make sure that we're protecting against all the data that's been collected about that individual for recruitment selection. So that's the ones that stay and that we select, and the ones that don't get the final job as well. They all need to be dealt with in line with the Data Protection Act, and in simple terms that's about keeping their data securely and only using it for the purpose it was collected for, and getting rid of it if we don't need it anymore. Right then, point 3 there. Once the candidate's been selected, we need to make sure we get that new recruit off to a good start. It's vital in the success of their role. They need to feel welcomed, they need to feel settled into their role in the organisation, and failing to do that's going to give a bad impression and make them feel unwanted. You've spent a lot of time, and we hear about this all the time, spent a lot of time and money attracting and recruiting the right candidate, so we want them to be as effective as possible and get started and feel welcomed and feel they can fit in as soon as possible. They'll probably be on a probation period, usually included in the contract, 3 to 6 months, for example, so the employer can see whether they fit in and the employee can see whether they fit in. It's going to be detailed in their written terms of conditions, and possibly there'll be a letter confirming the probationary period and how long it will be. At the end of that, a decision has to be made, and we need to make sure that we know what we're going to do with that person. Next step's going to be probably settling them in with an induction program, which is going to have to be a standardized, effective way of improving the relationships between the employee and the employer, making sure that their managers know what's going on, making sure they know what's going on. Length will be determined by the employer. You'll have different things within your organization, but I'm sure as a team leader, supervisor, first line manager, you'll have some impact in how that induction is carried out. So they're going to need a standardized induction. There's nothing worse than someone turning around to other employees as they get talking and saying, oh, I wasn't told that, oh, I was told that. If we want to make people feel welcomed at home in the organisation, it needs to be standardised. Yes, you can add little bits afterwards, but the basic one should be standardised. And there are some legal requirements that the employer must follow according to ACAS in putting in place, and they are that they must outline the health and safety precautions that the employee must take to protect them from harm. And most of these are based around health and safety and making sure the person's safe. You should outline any training they will need to do their job safely, so that they're not endangering other workers. They've got protective equipment, protective clothing for any equipment they will use, etc. We should ensure that they know what the fire, accident and emergency procedures are, and legally we should also be outlining the organisation's insurance policy in case they get hurt or are ill caused by work. So we need to make sure we're not discriminating. We need to make sure that, and you can make sure that anyone who starts in your team has received all these things from the organisation. And we need to make sure that we're making it a good process for them to go through and that everybody feels comfortable. And let's have a look on this next slide, bringing all that together, because ACAS in the guide that is in the resources, which you can read in more detail, gives some key steps that we should be following for someone joining our organisation. And these key things start before the employee's even started with us. As soon as we know that we've got that employee coming, we need to make sure that we have all the information that they need to start, so where to turn up, what to bring with them, and that we've planned an induction. There's nothing worse than arriving as a new employee and finding that you're not really expected, that the induction's a bit ad hoc. On day one, they should be shown around. We should deal with those important documents and the health and safety that we've outlined, those key steps. And within the first week, they should really know who's who, how the organisation works, its rules, what's available for them, the facilities, and where their role fits into the organisation and what their part is to play. And we should also be explaining how the performance is to be assessed, where the performance reviews, when they're going to get feedback, etc., because that'll people feel comfortable and know what's coming. There should be no surprises, as we've talked about before, in feedback and performance reviews. And within the first month, they should informally establish how the employee is settling in, and that'll be part of that first week when we talked about the feedback and performance. So how are they getting on? What do they need? Is there anything they need? Have they got any concerns? And that feedback should be realistic and give them a reassurance that things are going in the right direction. As we've said before, there should be absolutely no surprises at feedback. And then if we've done that well over the next 3 months, it's just about monitoring their performance, helping them improve, agreeing any support or new objectives. Up to the period of 6 months, or end of probation if that's 3 months, where we confirm that probation period has been passed, or we extend it, or we dismiss them, as we talked about, and then review performance for the ongoing 6-month period. So we're starting the process now as saying you're part of the organisation and this is where we expect you to go. We're going to work with you. It doesn't stop there really, because really it's up until the first 12 months when we hold the first formal sort of performance review and ask them for them feedback. We should be asking for them feedback from and using them as a new employee. They're a test candidate for our latest induction process and embedding people into the organisation. And we should seek their feedback on that. It's a good way of us getting feedback from technically a customer of our induction process. And then finally, ongoing support and development. This should, as we talked about before, this becomes a rolling performance review becomes a rolling process as we go through. So that's ACAS's key steps. The guide has got a lot more information in it about recruitment and selection process. And on the next slide, we'll just start recapping for the end of this unit. Right then, let's just round up with a quick recap. Our aim was to understand HR procedures and legal requirements. We said by the end of the session you'd be able to explain the legal requirements that must be adhered to when dealing with recruitment, selection, discipline and grievance, sickness and absence management, and harassment and bullying. And then we said we would describe the HR systems and procedures within your organisation and how these meet the legal requirements. That second one we're going to do in an activity which I'm going to go through in a minute, because you need to use what we've talked about now and go away and look at your individual organisation's policies and procedures. So let's have a look at the activity. So for this activity, you're going to need to examine, evaluate your HR systems and procedures within your organisation, covering the discussed discipline and grievance, recruitment and selection, harassment and bullying, and we previously touched on sickness and absence in Unit 301, the session before this when we talked about performance management, and earlier in the unit when we talked about dealing with difficult conversations. So we need to make sure that we're looking at your specific HR systems and software. So you could have things such as a system for recording sickness and absence. It may be just a case of informing HR, but whatever the policy and procedures within your organisation, you need to outline where it's meeting the areas we've talked about and where it's meeting the legal requirements. So this is going to involve a bit of research a bit of checking up. That might give you a chance to make sure you're fully familiar with your policies and procedures, or just a case of making sure it ticks all the boxes. But you need to write a report covering that, and there's a detailed sheet giving you an outline about how to do that. And that will complete this unit. And let's have a look at what to do next. So, as I said previously, we've completed all the sessions for this unit now. That's Unit 301, Managing People. And this unit will be externally assessed using an online assessment with the previous unit, Unit 300, Leading People. Nothing to worry about at the moment. The date and time for this assessment will be discussed between you and your employer and your assessor at a mutually agreeable time. But that will be a test, Unit 317, Leading and Managing People. Just a little bit of information for that. There'll be 40 questions, 47 marks, and you get an hour. The pass mark is not too high. It's 26 out of 47. So with what you've been supplied with and the final activity and a bit of research, you should be absolutely fine. So nothing to worry about at the moment. We'll leave that until we have a discussion about that and plan when you're going to sit that. But review the evidence required for the skills unit 305 for Managing People. There's a link in the resources and there's a sheet telling you what you'll need to produce when we get to that unit. But while it's fresh in your mind, it's good to have a look and start thinking about opportunities that might come up. And then once you've completed the activity and submitted it that we just discussed, you can then move on to the next unit, Unit 303, Communication. So get your activity completed, upload it, have a think about the sorts of types of evidence that you might be able to produce from the workplace by looking at the guidance sheet 305, Managing People, and then move on to the next unit.